Captain Saracen adjusted her tactical vest one final time as the Black Hawk helicopter cut through the morning sky above the mountainous terrain of Afghanistan. The rhythmic thump of the rotor blades provided a steady backdrop to her racing thoughts. Below them, intelligence reports indicated a heavily fortified enemy compound nestled in a valley that had been causing significant problems for coalition forces in the region. Sarah had been with the 75th Ranger Regiment for 8 years, working her way up through the ranks with a combination of exceptional marksmanship skills, tactical brilliance, and an unwavering determination that had earned her the respect of both her superiors and the soldiers under her command. At 32, she was one of the youngest female officers to lead combat operations in such challenging terrain, but her track record spoke for itself. The mission briefing had been clear but daunting. A high-value target, suspected to be coordinating attacks against supply convoys, had been tracked to this remote location. The compound was surrounded by steep cliffs and narrow passages that made conventional ground assault extremely difficult. The only viable approach was a direct helicopter insertion, followed by a coordinated assault to neutralize the threat and gather intelligence. As the helicopter approached the designated landing zone, Sarah could see the rocky terrain below becoming more detailed. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset, informing the team that they were 2 minutes out from the drop point. She looked around at her team of 12 elite soldiers, each one focused and ready for what lay ahead. These were men and women she had trained with for months, and she knew she could count on every single one of them. The landscape below was harsh and unforgiving. Jagged rocks jutted up from the earth like ancient sentinels, and the sparse vegetation provided little cover for anyone attempting to move across the terrain. The enemy had chosen this location well, knowing that its natural defenses would make any assault extremely challenging. But Sarah and her team had faced difficult odds before, and they had always found a way to accomplish their objectives. The helicopter began its descent, and Sarah could feel her heart rate increasing despite years of training and experience. This was always the moment when training gave way to reality, when all the preparation and planning would be put to the ultimate test. She checked her rifle one more time, ensuring that everything was in perfect working order. The weapon had been her constant companion through numerous deployments, and she trusted it completely. Through the helicopter's window, she could see the enemy compound coming into view. It was larger than the intelligence reports had indicated, with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways and what appeared to be several defensive positions built into the natural rock formations. Smoke was rising from one of the buildings, suggesting that the occupants were unaware of the approaching threat. The pilot's voice came through the headset again, this time with an urgency that made Sarah's blood run cold. Enemy fighters had been spotted moving toward anti-aircraft positions on the ridgeline above the compound. The helicopter was now in immediate danger, and the original landing zone had been compromised. They needed to adapt their plan quickly or risk losing the element of surprise entirely. Sarah made a split-second decision that would define the entire mission. Instead of waiting for the pilot to find an alternative landing zone, she ordered her team to prepare for a fast rope insertion directly over the compound. This was an extremely dangerous maneuver that would put them in the middle of enemy territory without the benefit of a secure landing area, but it was their only chance to maintain the initiative. The helicopter hovered approximately 60 feet above the compound's central courtyard as Sarah's team prepared their ropes. The sound of the rotors would certainly alert any defenders to their presence, but there was no alternative now. She could see movement below as enemy fighters began emerging from buildings and taking defensive positions. Without hesitation, Sarah was the first to hook onto the rope and begin her descent. As she rappelled down toward the compound, she could hear the distinctive crack of rifle fire beginning to echo off the surrounding cliffs. The enemy was reacting faster than anticipated, and her team would be landing directly into a firefight. The descent seemed to take forever, even though she knew it was only a matter of seconds. As she got closer to the ground, she could see the faces of enemy fighters looking up at her with surprise and alarm. Some were already raising their weapons, preparing to fire on the descending soldiers. Sarah drew her sidearm while still on the rope, knowing that she would need to start fighting the moment her boots touched the ground. She landed hard in the dusty courtyard, rolling to absorb the impact and immediately taking cover behind a low stone wall. The rest of her team was descending behind her, but she was alone for these critical first moments. Enemy fighters were converging on her position from multiple directions, and she could hear the sharp whistle of bullets passing close to her head. Sarah's training took over completely as she assessed the tactical situation. The compound was laid out in a rough square, with the main building directly ahead of her and smaller structures on either side. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions, indicating that the enemy force was larger than intelligence had suggested. But she also noticed something that gave her hope: the defenders seemed disorganized and surprised by the sudden assault. The first of her team members landed nearby, immediately adding his firepower to the engagement. Within seconds, more soldiers were on the ground, and they began executing the urban combat tactics they had drilled countless times in training. Sarah coordinated their movements with hand signals, directing teams to different objectives while maintaining suppressing fire on the enemy positions. The sound of gunfire was deafening as it echoed off the surrounding cliffs, creating a chaotic symphony of violence that would have been terrifying to anyone not trained for combat. But Sarah felt a strange sense of calm descending over her as she moved from cover to cover, directing her team's assault on the compound. This was what she had trained for her entire military career. As her team established fire superiority in the courtyard, Sarah began planning their next moves. They needed to clear each building systematically, ensuring that no enemy fighters could mount a counterattack from behind their lines. The main building appeared to be their primary objective, but they would need to secure the surrounding structures first to prevent being flanked or cut off from their extraction point. The helicopter had moved to a safer distance but remained in the area, ready to provide support fire if needed. Sarah could hear the pilot's voice in her headset, providing updates on enemy movements that he could observe from above. Additional enemy fighters were approaching the compound from the north, but they were still several minutes away if her team could maintain their current pace of advance. Sarah signaled for her team to begin the building clearing operations. 2 soldiers moved toward the structure on the left while another team approached the building on the right. She would lead the assault on the main building once the flanking positions were secure. Every movement was calculated and deliberate, designed to minimize their exposure to enemy fire while maintaining momentum in their attack. The first building was cleared within minutes, with 2 enemy fighters captured and several weapons seized. The team reported finding communications equipment and what appeared to be maps of the surrounding area. This confirmed that they had found an important enemy position, but it also suggested that their primary target might have already been alerted to their presence. As Sarah prepared to move toward the main building, she noticed something troubling. The volume of enemy fire had decreased significantly, and there were no longer any muzzle flashes visible from the windows of the primary structure. Either the defenders had been eliminated or wounded, or they were preparing some kind of trap for the advancing soldiers. She made the decision to approach the main building with extra caution, using smoke grenades to conceal their movement across the open courtyard. As the thick gray smoke began to fill the area, Sarah led her remaining team members in a rapid advance toward their primary objective. Whatever was waiting for them inside that building, they would face it together as a team. The heavy wooden door of the main building stood slightly ajar, and Sarah could see nothing but darkness beyond it. This was the moment that would determine the success or failure of their entire mission. Everything they had trained for, all the risks they had taken, had led to this single point in time. Sarah took a deep breath, checked her weapon one final time, and prepared to enter the unknown. Sarah pressed her back against the rough stone wall beside the entrance to the main building, her rifle ready as she listened for any sounds from within. The silence was almost more unsettling than the gunfire had been moments before. Her team of 4 soldiers was positioned behind her, waiting for her signal to breach the doorway. She could feel the weight of responsibility for their lives pressing down on her shoulders, but she pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the tactical situation. The smoke from their concealment grenades was beginning to dissipate, and Sarah knew they needed to move quickly before losing their cover. She signaled to Sergeant Rodriguez, her most experienced demolitions expert, to prepare a flashbang grenade. The concussive blast would disorient any defenders waiting inside while giving her team the crucial seconds they needed to establish control of the room. Rodriguez nodded and pulled the pin from the grenade, waiting for Sarah's count. She held up 3 fingers, then 2, then 1. The grenade sailed through the partially open door and detonated with a thunderous boom that seemed to shake the entire building. Before the sound had even finished echoing, Sarah was through the doorway with her team close behind. The interior of the building was larger than she had expected, with a central room that opened into several smaller chambers. Traditional Afghan carpets covered much of the floor, and the walls were decorated with intricate patterns that spoke of the building's original peaceful purpose. But now it had been converted into a military command center, with communications equipment, maps, and ammunition scattered throughout the space. What struck Sarah immediately was that the room appeared to have been abandoned in haste. Papers were scattered across a large wooden table, some still bearing the warmth of recent handling. A radio crackled with distant voices speaking in a local dialect, and she could smell the lingering aroma of recently extinguished cooking fires. The enemy had been here moments before their arrival, but they had vanished like ghosts. Sarah's team quickly moved to clear the adjoining rooms, their movements precise and coordinated despite the adrenaline coursing through their veins. Each room told the same story: recent occupation followed by hasty abandonment. In one chamber, they found sleeping areas with blankets still warm to the touch. Another room contained an extensive weapons cache, including several rocket-propelled grenades and enough ammunition to supply a small army. But it was the discovery in the final room that made Sarah realize the true scope of what they had stumbled upon. The chamber was filled with detailed maps of the entire region, marked with locations of coalition bases, supply routes, and patrol schedules. This wasn't just a simple enemy outpost, it was a major intelligence and coordination center that had been gathering information on Allied operations throughout the province. Sergeant Martinez, her communications specialist, had been examining the radio equipment in the main room. He called Sarah over with an urgency that immediately caught her attention. The radio was still receiving transmissions, and, while he couldn't understand the language being spoken, the frequency and tone suggested that enemy forces throughout the area were being coordinated for some kind of major operation. Sarah made the decision to have Martinez attempt to record as much of the radio traffic as possible while the rest of the team gathered intelligence materials. Every document, every map, every piece of equipment could provide valuable information about enemy capabilities and intentions. But, even as they worked, she was acutely aware that they were operating on borrowed time. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors reminded Sarah that their extraction window was limited. The pilot's voice crackled through her headset with an update that made her blood run cold. Enemy reinforcements were converging on their location from 3 different directions, and they had approximately 15 minutes before being completely surrounded. But Sarah also knew that the intelligence they were gathering could save countless lives if it revealed the details of the enemy operation that was apparently being planned. She made the difficult decision to extend their time on the ground, knowing that it would increase the risk to her team but potentially prevent a much larger disaster. As her soldiers continued gathering materials, Sarah examined the maps more closely. What she saw made her realize that they had uncovered something far more significant than a simple enemy outpost. The map showed detailed plans for a coordinated attack on the main coalition supply base in the region, scheduled to take place within the next 48 hours. The attack would involve multiple enemy units striking simultaneously from different directions, potentially overwhelming the base's defenses. The implications were staggering. The supply base housed not only critical military equipment but also served as a medical facility for wounded soldiers from throughout the region. If the enemy attack succeeded, it would be a devastating blow to coalition operations and could result in hundreds of casualties. Sarah immediately contacted her commanding officer via radio, providing a brief overview of what they had discovered. The response was immediate and decisive. They needed to gather as much information as possible about the planned attack, regardless of the personal risk to the team. The potential to prevent a major enemy victory was worth the additional danger they would face. With renewed purpose, Sarah's team intensified their intelligence-gathering efforts. They photographed every document, copied every map, and recorded all radio frequencies that might be relevant to the planned attack. Martinez worked feverishly to decode some of the radio transmissions, using his limited knowledge of the local language to piece together fragments of the enemy communications. Meanwhile, Sarah positioned herself at one of the building's windows to observe the surrounding area. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Enemy fighters were visible moving along the ridgelines around the compound, and she could see the dust clouds kicked up by approaching vehicles in the distance. They were rapidly running out of time, But the intelligence they were gathering could be the key to preventing a catastrophic attack on coalition forces. The sound of gunfire erupted from the courtyard outside as her perimeter security team engaged the first of the approaching enemy forces. Sarah knew that their window for extraction was closing rapidly, but she also understood that leaving now might mean abandoning the chance to prevent a much larger tragedy. She made another difficult command decision, ordering half of her team to begin moving toward the extraction point while the remainder continued gathering intelligence. This would allow them to maintain security while ensuring that the most critical information made it back to headquarters even if the entire team couldn't be extracted safely. As the gunfire outside intensified, Sarah found herself facing one of the most challenging moments of her military career. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly, but the potential value of the intelligence they were gathering could save hundreds of lives. Every additional minute they remained in the compound increased their personal risk exponentially, but it also increased the chances of uncovering information that could prevent the planned enemy attack. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at her side, reporting that the communications equipment included detailed frequency lists and encryption codes that could allow coalition forces to monitor enemy communications throughout the region. This information alone could provide weeks or months of advance warning about enemy operations, potentially changing the entire strategic situation in the province. Sarah looked around the room one final time, mentally cataloging everything they had discovered. The weapons cache, the detailed maps, the communications equipment, and the evidence of the planned attack all painted a picture of a sophisticated enemy operation that had been months in the planning. Her team had stumbled upon something that could alter the course of the entire campaign in the region. But now came the most dangerous part of their mission, getting out alive with the intelligence they had gathered. The sound of approaching vehicles was growing louder, and she could hear the distinctive whistle of incoming mortar rounds beginning to impact around the compound. The enemy was preparing to assault their position with overwhelming force. Sarah gathered her remaining team members and prepared to fight their way out of the compound. They had accomplished far more than anyone could have expected, but now they needed to survive long enough to share what they had learned with the forces that could act on the intelligence. The next few minutes would determine whether their mission would be remembered as a great success or a tragic loss. The first mortar round impacted just outside the main building, sending chunks of stone and debris crashing through the windows. Sarah felt the concussion wave wash over her as she grabbed the last of the intelligence documents and stuffed them into her tactical pack. The enemy had found their range, and the next rounds would be even more accurate. "Martinez, Rodriguez, we're moving now," Sarah shouted over the increasing din of explosions and gunfire. Her two remaining team members quickly gathered their equipment and the most critical intelligence materials. The radio equipment was too heavy to carry, but Martinez had managed to download the frequency lists and encryption codes onto a portable device that could provide invaluable intelligence to coalition forces. Sarah led her small team toward the rear exit of the building, knowing that the main entrance would likely be covered by enemy fire. As they moved through the building, she could hear the sound of approaching vehicles growing louder. The enemy reinforcements were arriving in force, and her team would soon be facing overwhelming odds. The rear of the building opened onto a narrow alleyway that ran between the main structure and one of the smaller outbuildings. Sarah cautiously peered around the corner and immediately pulled back as rifle fire erupted from positions along the opposite wall. Enemy fighters had already moved to surround the compound, cutting off what should have been their primary escape route. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, but Sarah's mind remained focused on finding a solution. Years of training and combat experience had taught her that there was almost always a way out of even the most desperate situations, but it required clear thinking and decisive action. She studied the layout of the compound in her mind, looking for alternatives that might not be obvious to the enemy forces. Above them, she could hear the distinctive sound of their extraction helicopter circling at a safe distance. The pilot's voice came through her headset with an update that confirmed what she already knew: the landing zone was completely compromised, and a conventional extraction was no longer possible. But the pilot also reported something that gave Sarah a new idea for getting her team out alive. The compound was built against the face of a steep cliff, and the pilot had spotted what appeared to be a narrow ledge that ran along the cliff face about 30 feet above the building. If they could reach that ledge, the helicopter might be able to extract them using a rope ladder, even under fire. It was an extremely dangerous plan that would require precise timing and considerable luck, but it was their only remaining option. Sarah explained the plan to her team as mortar rounds continued to impact around the compound. They would need to climb to the roof of the main building and, then, make their way up the cliff face to reach the ledge. The entire movement would have to be completed while under direct enemy fire, but staying in their current position would certainly result in capture or death. Rodriguez immediately began preparing climbing equipment while Martinez continued monitoring enemy radio communications. The radio chatter had increased dramatically, confirming that enemy forces were coordinating a final assault on the compound. They had perhaps 10 minutes before being completely overwhelmed. The three soldiers made their way to an interior staircase that led to the building's roof. As they climbed, Sarah could hear enemy fighters moving through the lower levels of the structure, systematically clearing each room. The sound of their boots on the stone floors was growing closer, and she knew that discovery was only minutes away. The roof of the building was flat and surrounded by a low wall that provided some cover from direct fire. But, as soon as they emerged from the stairwell, Sarah could see enemy fighters positioned on the surrounding ridgelines with clear lines of sight to their location. Moving across the roof to reach the cliff face would require crossing approximately 40 feet of open ground while under observation by multiple enemy positions. Sarah made the decision to use their remaining smoke grenades to provide concealment for the movement. Rodriguez threw 2 grenades simultaneously, creating a thick gray cloud that obscured visibility across the entire roof. But smoke would also alert the enemy to their location, and they could expect incoming fire even if the shooters couldn't see their exact positions. The three soldiers moved quickly across the roof as rifle fire began impacting around them. Sarah could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her head, but the smoke was providing enough concealment to prevent accurate targeting. They reached the base of the cliff face just as the smoke began to dissipate, giving them perhaps 30 seconds of remaining cover. Rodriguez was already securing climbing ropes to anchor points in the rock face. The cliff was nearly vertical, but there were enough handholds and ledges to make the climb possible for experienced soldiers. The challenge would be completing the ascent while under direct fire from enemy positions that would soon have clear shots at the climbing team. Sarah went first, knowing that her team would follow her lead regardless of the danger. As she began climbing, she could hear the sound of enemy fighters reaching the roof below. Shouts in the local dialect indicated that their position had been discovered, and she knew that accurate fire would begin impacting their climbing route within seconds. The rock face was rough and provided good handholds, but Sarah was carrying a full combat load that made every movement more difficult. Her tactical pack, loaded with intelligence documents, seemed to grow heavier with each foot of altitude gained. But she forced herself to maintain a steady pace, knowing that any hesitation would make her an easier target for the enemy shooters below. Martinez was climbing about 10 feet below her, with Rodriguez bringing up the rear while providing suppressing fire at the enemy positions on the roof. The sound of gunfire was constant now, with bullets striking the rock face around them and sending chips of stone flying in all directions. But the angle was working in their favor. It was difficult for the enemy shooters to achieve accurate fire at targets directly above their positions. Halfway up the cliff face, Sarah could see the ledge that represented their salvation. It was wider than it had appeared from below, providing enough space for the helicopter to hover nearby while they climbed aboard via rope ladder. But reaching that ledge would require climbing another 15 feet while completely exposed to enemy fire. The sound of the extraction helicopter was growing louder as the pilot moved into position for the rescue attempt. Sarah could hear him coordinating with ground controllers, preparing to provide covering fire with the aircraft's mounted weapons. But the helicopter would also become a target for enemy fighters, and the window for extraction would be extremely limited. Rodriguez called up from below that enemy reinforcements were arriving at the compound in significant numbers. Vehicle-mounted weapons were being positioned to engage both the climbing team and the helicopter, and surface-to-air missiles had been spotted among the enemy equipment. The tactical situation was becoming impossible, but they were committed to their current course of action. Sarah reached the ledge first, immediately taking a defensive position to provide covering fire for her team members still climbing below. The view from the ledge was both spectacular and terrifying. She could see enemy fighters throughout the compound and surrounding area, all focused on preventing their escape. Vehicle-mounted machine guns were already being trained on their position, and she could see the distinctive shapes of rocket-propelled grenade launchers being prepared. Martinez reached the ledge moments later, followed by Rodriguez, who was bleeding from a grazing wound to his left arm. All three soldiers were exhausted from the climb and the stress of being under constant fire, but they had successfully reached their extraction point with the invaluable intelligence intact. The extraction helicopter appeared around the cliff face, flying low and fast to minimize its exposure to enemy fire. The pilot's skill was evident as he maneuvered the aircraft into position despite the challenging terrain and hostile environment. But, as the rope ladder descended toward the ledge, Sarah could see enemy fighters repositioning to engage the helicopter with everything they had. This was the moment that would determine the success or failure of their entire mission. 3 soldiers stood on a narrow ledge high above an enemy compound, laden with intelligence that could save hundreds of lives, waiting for a helicopter extraction under intense hostile fire. Everything they had trained for, everything they had risked, had led to this single moment in time. The rope ladder swayed violently in the downdraft from the helicopter's rotors as Sarah reached for the bottom rung. Below them, the entire compound had erupted into a fury of gunfire and explosions as enemy fighters concentrated all their firepower on preventing the extraction. Tracer rounds streaked through the air like deadly fireworks, and the distinctive whoosh of rocket-propelled grenades added to the chaos. Sarah grabbed the ladder and began climbing as quickly as possible while maintaining her grip on the intelligence materials. Every second of delay increased the danger to both her team and the helicopter crew. Behind her, Martinez was already on the ladder, his equipment pack secured tightly to prevent losing any of the valuable intelligence they had gathered. Rodriguez remained on the ledge, providing covering fire with his rifle while waiting for his turn to climb. Despite his wounded arm, he maintained steady and accurate fire that kept some of the enemy shooters pinned down. His sacrifice of going last was typical of the selflessness that had made him one of the most respected soldiers in their unit. The helicopter shuddered as enemy fire began finding its mark. Sarah could hear the distinctive ping of bullets striking the aircraft's armored hull, but the pilot maintained his position with remarkable skill and courage. The crew chief was leaning out of the cabin door, providing suppressing fire with a mounted machine gun while helping to stabilize the rope ladder. As Sarah climbed higher, she could see the full scope of the enemy force that had assembled around the compound. There were at least 40 fighters visible in various positions, with more arriving in vehicles that kicked up dust clouds throughout the valley. The intelligence her team had gathered was clearly more valuable than anyone had realized. The enemy was willing to commit significant resources to prevent it from reaching coalition headquarters. Martinez reached the helicopter cabin and was immediately pulled inside by the crew chief. Sarah was close behind, her arms burning from the effort of climbing while carrying a full combat load. As she reached the cabin door, strong hands grabbed her equipment pack and, then, her tactical vest, hauling her into the relative safety of the aircraft interior. But Rodriguez was still on the ledge below, and Sarah could see that his situation was becoming desperate. Enemy fighters had reached positions where they could fire directly at his location, and the rock chips flying around him showed just how intense the incoming fire had become. The helicopter couldn't wait much longer without risking the lives of everyone aboard. Sarah grabbed her rifle from the helicopter's weapons rack and moved to the cabin door to provide covering fire for Rodriguez. Her shots were precise and effective, forcing several enemy fighters to seek cover just as Rodriguez began his climb up the rope ladder. But she could also see enemy fighters with rocket-propelled grenades moving into positions where they could engage the helicopter directly. The first RPG streaked past the helicopter's nose, missing by mere feet before exploding against the cliff face in a shower of rock and flame. The pilot immediately began evasive maneuvers, causing the rope ladder to swing wildly with Rodriguez still climbing desperately toward safety. The second rocket was even closer, and Sarah knew that the next one might not miss. Rodriguez was halfway up the ladder when a burst of machine gun fire from a vehicle-mounted weapon caught him in the leg. Sarah watched in horror as her friend and teammate struggled to maintain his grip while blood poured from his wound. But Rodriguez had survived too many battles to give up now. He continued climbing with determination that inspired everyone watching. The helicopter's door gunner had identified the vehicle mounting the machine gun and began engaging it with concentrated fire. The enemy vehicle erupted in flames as the helicopter's rounds found their mark, eliminating one of the most serious threats to the extraction. But more enemy fighters were moving into position, and the situation remained critical. Sarah reached down and grabbed Rodriguez's equipment pack as he neared the cabin door, then helped pull him into the helicopter. His leg wound was serious but not life-threatening, and the medic immediately began treating it while the aircraft began climbing away from the hostile area. All 3 team members had made it aboard with the intelligence intact. As the helicopter gained altitude and distance from the compound, Sarah looked back at the scene of their desperate battle. Smoke was rising from multiple locations throughout the valley, and she could still see the muzzle flashes of enemy weapons firing uselessly at their departing aircraft. They had accomplished something that would have seemed impossible just hours before. The flight back to their forward operating base gave Sarah time to process what they had achieved. The intelligence materials in their possession included detailed plans for a major enemy attack that could have resulted in hundreds of coalition casualties. By uncovering and disrupting these plans, her small team had potentially saved more lives than any single military action in the region's recent history. But the true value of their mission went beyond preventing a single attack. The communications equipment they had captured and the frequency lists Martinez had downloaded would allow coalition forces to monitor enemy communications throughout the province. This intelligence advantage could provide advance warning of future attacks and give coalition commanders the information needed to defeat enemy operations before they could be launched. The pilot's voice came through Sarah's headset with an update from headquarters. The intelligence materials had already been transmitted via secure communication, and analysts were working around the clock to decode and analyze every piece of information. Initial reports suggested that the intelligence coup was even more significant than they had realized during their hasty extraction. Rodriguez's wound was treated and stabilized during the flight, and he would make a full recovery within a few weeks. Martinez had suffered only minor injuries from rock chips during their climb, and Sarah herself had emerged from the operation unscathed. Considering the intensity of the combat they had faced, their casualties had been remarkably light. As their helicopter approached the forward operating base, Sarah could see increased activity throughout the installation. Additional security measures had been implemented based on the intelligence her team had gathered, and she could see additional aircraft being positioned for what would likely be preemptive strikes against enemy positions identified in the captured documents. The debriefing process began immediately after their arrival, with intelligence officers eager to hear every detail of what the team had observed and discovered. Sarah provided a comprehensive account of their observations, from the layout of the compound to the behavior and apparent training level of the enemy fighters they had encountered. The captured documents revealed a sophisticated enemy network that extended far beyond the single compound they had raided. Plans were already being developed for follow-up operations against other identified enemy positions, using the intelligence her team had gathered as the foundation for a broader campaign to disrupt enemy operations throughout the region. Within 48 hours, coalition forces had launched coordinated strikes against 3 additional enemy compounds identified in the captured materials. All 3 operations were successful, resulting in the capture of significant weapons caches and the disruption of enemy communication networks. The planned attack on the coalition supply base was abandoned as enemy forces scattered to avoid the ongoing operations. Sarah received commendation from the highest levels of military command for her leadership during the operation. But, for her, the greatest satisfaction came from knowing that her team's actions had prevented a tragedy that could have cost hundreds of lives. The risks they had taken and the dangers they had faced had been justified by the results they achieved. Months later, intelligence analysts were still discovering valuable information in the materials captured during Sarah's raid. Enemy communication networks throughout the province had been compromised, allowing coalition forces to anticipate and counter enemy operations with unprecedented effectiveness. The single helicopter insertion that had seemed so desperate at the time had fundamentally changed the strategic situation in the entire region. Rodriguez returned to active duty after his recovery, prouder than ever to serve alongside soldiers like Sarah who exemplified the best traditions of military service. Martinez was promoted and transferred to a specialized intelligence unit where his skills could be used to maximum advantage. And Sarah continued leading combat operations, always remembering that sometimes the greatest victories come from the missions that seem most impossible at the start.